I just realized this morning that we've been doing this now for more than 25 years in this department. And I think that there's something to the longevity of this intellectual event. And I think that we ought to just sort of celebrate that in our minds, that we have been able to maintain this. Today, my role is slender. I am introducing Professor Shali Nana, who is Director of the Health and Risk Communication Center. And I want to point out that it is due to the good graces of that center that we have our speaker today.
Okay, folks, thanks for coming today. As you know, the Center for Health and Risk Communication, we're launching a so-called distinguished speaker series. We hope to do this once every semester, every spring and fall semester. And today, I'm very honored to introduce our inaugural speaker, Dr. Cappella. Certainly, as many of you know, that Dr. Cappella has a very decorated academic career, and that's why he's here. He is the Gerald R. Miller Professor of Communication at the Edinburgh School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He has published 150 articles and book chapters and 4 co-authored books in areas of health and political communication, social interaction, nonverbal behavior, media effects, and statistical methods. Dr. Cappella's research has been supported by grants from numerous sources, including the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Food and Drug Administration, and several nonprofit and private foundations. So it's a very long list of grants he's gotten. And he has served on the editorial boards of 20 different journals. He is a fellow of the International Communication Association and he's past president. He is a distinguished scholar of the National Communication Association and the recipient of the Aubrey Fisher Mentorship Award. So lots of awards. So today he's going to talk about some of the research work he's doing at 10, and I have asked Dr. Cappella to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes and leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. Okay? So without much ado, let me introduce Dr. Cappella.
Very much, Ali, for that very kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to be here at the University of Maryland. I actually taught at the University of Maryland probably 25 or 30 years ago, when most of you didn't even exist. And I actually did a job interview here, but you guys didn't hire me. I'm not sure why exactly, but I obviously blew that. I'll try to make up for it today. So it is a real pleasure to be here, and I welcome the great weather in your beautiful campus, and I wish you a great deal of luck with your new Center in Health and Risk Communication. It's an area that is of considerable interest to many national agencies and deals with questions which are certainly core to the way in which work in health communication has been directed. So good luck with that, and I wish you the greatest amount of success. Today I want to talk to you about some work that we have been doing over the last really several years on effective health messages in the public domain, and some of the work that we've done to date, and some new work that we're doing on recommendation systems, which I hope you'll find interesting. Like with all work today in the world of interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary procedures, there are many people involved in the process over a very long period of time. The grad students, postdocs, research directors, faculty members, undergraduate students, and so on. This is a small list, I think pretty comprehensive. recently, I'll mention a couple of names specifically to give you some idea of who's had primary responsibility for some of the work that we've done that I'm presenting to you today, including some recent contributors from our colleague institution, sister institution out in Los Angeles at USC, the Annenberg School there. We've also had a lot of funding for this from the National Cancer Institute through the Center for Excellence in Cancer Communication, which we did work for about 11 years, and those are now over. That's Seeker 1 and Seeker 2, and then some data from a project that we call Eureka Project, and these are the funding agencies funding grant numbers from the agencies involved. So my goal here today is to talk to you about building a science of messages. And what I'm going to tell you basically is that we've developed some tools for testing messages in a way that's efficient and effective. I'm going to try to generate some principles from the data that we have for designing effective messages at the population level, and try to hypothesize some of the kinds of causal mechanisms that I think operate underneath some of these kinds of effects that I'll tell you about. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to play journalist. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. All right? So those of you who are teaching basic journalism know that's exactly what a good journalist does. I'm not a journalist, but I'm trying to learn from them as well. I think we built a message testing protocol that's reliable and valid. I think we have some pretty good data that tells us about message features that explain a lot of variance at the population level. And I'll make this distinction sharply between individuals and the population at large. You'll see what form that takes. There's still a lot of individual variation left over, even after you've been successful, more or less, at predicting at the population level, and we have to try to account for some of those findings as well. And we'll look at some of the ways in which that individual variation can be accounted for using recommendation systems that are not terribly different from ones that we are all familiar with. Every time we go on Amazon, every time we go on Netflix, we get recommendations from them based on our past behavior and the past behavior of others. So let's talk about testing message effectiveness and how we go about doing that in our lab. First of all, we use real-world messages. We don't make up the messages. We use ones that either have been a part of campaigns, that have appeared on in public service announcement campaigns, that have appeared in the media, or have been produced for possible use in the media. We want to evaluate these messages in a way that's efficient, that costs us as little as possible, that is reliable so that we get the same results twice in a row, and that's valid so that the evaluations that we use tell us something about an outcome that we really actually care about. I'm trying to think of what do I mean by alternatives? By alternatives, what I mean is if you wanted to test whether a message was effective in the best way possible, but would be extremely inefficient, you would take that message out into the real world to your target population. You would deliver the message, make sure that they got exposure to it. You'd have a control group that didn't get exposure to that message. You would measure the outcomes that you cared about, intentions, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and so on, and you'd see whether the message worked. And guess what? A lot of times it wouldn't work. Now you're back to ground zero. That's very inefficient. Okay? It's very costly. You can't run a campaign with messages when, in fact, what you have to do is to test all of those messages in the form of a campaign. So, in effect, we need something pre-campaign, and that's what we're about trying to do. So, we're going to proceed by giving you some tools that we've developed over the course of time that allow us to do some efficient message testing before you take those messages out into a campaign context. And we're going to use an analysis and synthesis kind of approach. So the analysis approach is going to take the messages that we are interested in this case anti-smoking messages, and we're going to break them apart. We're going to break them into their content really and their format for delivering that content. And the content that we're going to focus primarily on is the argument that the message makes. We're going to try to measure the strength of that argument using a measure that we've developed and that has been widely tested and shown to be reliable, of 9 items with a high internal reliability, and that has good outcomes. I'll tell you more about this measure later on and try to convince you that it's an even better measure than its simple internal reliability. We'll also measure the effectiveness of the message overall. How effective is this message? How effective people perceive this message to be? It's a 4 or 5 item measure that we have used in a number of contexts, and we argue, and I'll present some other data later on, that will hopefully make the case to you that the perceived effectiveness measure is a pretty good measure of the intention to carry out the behavior. In this case, the behavior is smoking cessation, and the relationship here is a good one. We will do a lot of coding of audio features and video features of the message to get us at the format side. So the argument that we're going to try to pull out of the message is part of the content side. The format is how that argument is delivered in these real-world messages. Then we want to put everything back together and say, if you want to put this message together, let's put it together in the following way. So this is a quick and dirty representation of what we're doing. We've got a message here on the left-hand side. We're going to extract the argument from the text that's on the screen, from the audio, from the implicit argument that's made by the visuals present. We're going to rate that argument from people by using people in the target population. Sometimes we do computerized text analysis of the arguments. I'm not going to talk about that today. And then we will also code for the video and audio features and put them into a vector, if you will, a sequence of features that are characterized in the message. I'll tell you a little bit more about what those features are in a second. This moves quickly. We have a very powerful device here. Wow. So where do these message features come from? Did we just make them up, pull them out of a hat, and so on? Well, not quite pull them out of a hat, but we use really 3 core theories to help us think about messages. One, you're probably familiar, many of you are probably familiar with each of these theories, some not. The elaboration likelihood model from Pesce and Cacioppo, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Even those of you in public relations who are in the audience know about the ELM and the importance of argument strength and its relationship to the acceptance of the point of view that's being presented. You may be less familiar with Annie Lang's LC4NP theory, which is really a theory about limited capacity processing of mediated messages. But what's important about Annie's work is that she's identified a set of audio and video features that she calls information introduced that represent about 14 or 15 different features of messages that are categorized, that are supposed to be related to information, potentially related to the allocation of cognitive processing resources to the message at hand. Those features are certainly well established empirically by Lang in her lab and represented in this theory. The third theory is the activation model of information exchange by Donahue and Palmgreen, done out of Kentucky. The theory really is fundamentally applied originally to the work in anti-drug advertising, and what they have found is that messages can be identified in terms of, again, about 15 or so components that represent the sensation value of the message, intensity of emotion, camera changes, a variety of features that are supposedly related to how much attention people will pay to the content of the message to which they are exposed. Both of these latter two theories represent ways of looking at the format features of messages in terms of the attention that those format features might produce. So we start with a sample of messages, in this case texts or videos. I'm going to focus on videos today. I'm going to focus on a set of anti-smoking PSAs, 200 of them in fact, and we will take a random sample. For any one person will get a random sample from that set. And not only will they get a random sample from that set to evaluate, but they'll get them in random order. And the people who will do the evaluation of the messages or the arguments, whichever we're talking about at a particular point, will be those who are in the target population. So if the messages are geared to adult smokers, those are the people in the target population who do the evaluation. It would be silly, wouldn't it, to take messages geared to kids and have adults evaluate them, or vice versa. that just wouldn't make a lot of sense, even though it is not uncommon for that to happen. So we can raise it. We're going to use our measure of perceived effectiveness of the messages. I said that what will happen is that each person, what happens in all of our studies, the ones I'm going to use today, each person gets 4 PSAs to evaluate, 4 from a set, okay? They get 4 randomly selected from a set. They get those 4 in random order. So no message is in a particular position, no message set is given to a particular individual. So the first question you might ask yourself is, all right, you're giving them 4 messages, Cappella. Does it matter if you give them message 1 in position 1 or message 1 in position 2 or position 3 or position 4? And the short answer is it doesn't matter. We've done some careful assessment of order of messages, and what we did see is that in 1 of 5 studies, the initial position of the message, a message is evaluated as less favorable. Remember, these are smokers evaluating a message, but then after that message gets to the 4th position, it's a little bit more favorably evaluated. This is an example of an evaluation of argument strength for a message. In this case, people got 8 arguments to evaluate, not 4 PSAs, but 8 arguments. And you can see that there's some effect due to the initial arguments that people get. This is the order in which a particular argument was seen. And for the most part, either the effects are tiny or the effects are non-existent. So order doesn't matter a whole lot. Okay. Now the next question might be, how many evaluations do you need in order to say that you got a pretty good measure of perceived effectiveness? 10, 20, 50, 100, 1,000? What do you need? And so we've done whole bunches, because we do random assignment, we get some variation in the number of messages that people are evaluating, the number of people who are evaluating each message in our random order. And so the question might be, how far can we get with the number of messages that we have? I'm going to tell you the answer is about 23. I know that shows way too much certainty, but what I can point out to you is the following. Let me see if this will work. Okay, there are 2 different sets of graphs here. This is across 5 different studies where people had either 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, all the way up to about 45 people evaluating each message. This graph for across those 5 studies is a graph of misspecification. So across a number of messages that we had evaluated, the question is, if you broke them into 5 different groups, from the most positively evaluated, next to least, how many from the top group got forced into the bottom group incorrectly versus the bottom group into the top group incorrectly? And the short answer is that goes to essentially near 0, less than 0.5%, right out here. That's 23. All right, now it could be 20, right? It could be 25, but you don't need 40. All right, and you don't do too badly with 11, but there's still a couple of percent that are misspecified from highest to lowest. And then the other question is, how about with 0 misspecifications? Well, that goes way up. Again, it's up nearly to this. Now, this graph refers to this side here. So it's up to well over 95% at about 23. So I'm not telling you that 23 is the magic number. All I'm telling you is you don't need as many evaluators per message as you might think, and still get stable results relative to the whole population. The other thing is, what about this measure of perceived effectiveness? Perceived effectiveness is, after all, is that you think the message is convincing, do you think it's credible, do you think it's persuasive? And you say, wow, that's like a lousy measure, isn't it? And the answer is, it's an efficient measure. The real question is, does it relate to what we care about, which in this case would be the intention to quit smoking or not. And we carried out a whole bunch of studies in which we were able to show something that I think is very important. It's a little bit subtle, and so I'll take a couple minutes to explain it. It works like this. It's one thing for me to ask you, as a smoker whether you think this message is effective or not for you, and then ask you your intention. Well, your intention is as much a predictor of your evaluation as your evaluation is a predictor of your intention. So that's kind of a useless measure. But instead of asking you what your perceived effectiveness is, what if I took the aggregate number of people who evaluated that message? So the 23 or the 40 or the 60. And I took their aggregate score. And now I've shown you 4 messages. And there are 4 aggregate scores. And I give you a total score. So the amount of effectiveness that you got as seen by the group was a certain number. Now we look at what you said your intention was. So your intention versus the aggregate amount of perceived effectiveness that you got. That's what this analysis shows. This analysis shows essentially that the overall intention is reasonably well predicted, certainly significantly predicted, from the aggregate perceived effectiveness of the messages that people got. So it's a reasonable, the aggregate perceived effectiveness score is a good indicator of something we care about, the intention to quit smoking, something that's difficult to change, quitting smoking. It's even difficult to get people to move from I'm thinking about it to planning. All right, that's a big move for a smoker. It's a tough behavior to change. So we think that essentially we have a reliable measure of message effectiveness. We think it's efficient because people can evaluate multiple messages with little or no position effects. We can do that with a relatively small sample size per message. And we think that we have a valid measure because it predicts intentions to change what is a difficult measure to change. I think we have a tool. I think we have a protocol. And we have been using this protocol and we have pretty carefully evaluated it over a long period of time. All right, now we got a tool. We got to do something with it. Got to do something interesting and important with it. But now I can evaluate lots of messages quickly and in advance. So it's a practical tool, but now it's also a theoretical tool, and we want to see how we can do that theoretical application. And we're going to operate with some very simple kinds of principles. And that is, we're going to expect that the arguments that are in these messages represent necessary core content, and that core content, when it's engaged by the people in the target audience, strong arguments engaged cognitively by people in the target audience will have a greater likelihood of inducing persuasive effect, that is perceived effectiveness. However, if engagement is misdirected, this is something I've talked to a couple of you about in the last 24 hours or so, sometimes attention goes to the wrong thing. A joke that somebody tells that's not related to the content of the lecture. The joke is funny, we all laugh, we were engaged by that, but guess what? We didn't learn anything. All right, so the issue is here, what is the engagement directed at? And so we want to make sure that when audiences are engaged, they are indeed engaged and directed at the right things. Secondly, we're going to want to make sure that when we're using message features, we're using ones that are not tied to just a person's assessment, but they're either coded, rated, objective, or they are aggregate features of what the population says is the case. And then we'll try to get to the science, the causal basis for the claims that we make. All right, just to get pretty concrete and tell you essentially what conclusions we're going to make in general. Suppose we pretend we're the Kennel Club and we're going to do the best in show here. So across our 200 messages or so, suppose we pick off the top 5 and the bottom 5 in terms of the ones that are the most effective and the ones that are the least effective across the populations that we've used. So here are 3 of the top 5 in the arguments that they use. Smoking doesn't just kill you, it causes cancers that can be disfiguring, like having a hole in your neck or part of your face removed surgically. So that's an argument that was made in one of the messages. Not in exactly that form, but like that form. And you'll notice I put in some of the visuals into that argument as well. Look at the top one and the bottom 5. Cigarette companies and advertising executives don't care about the fact that cigarettes are dangerous and will kill you. To them, it's a big joke. That's an argument that has been used in legacy campaigns, and with adults, it doesn't work much at all. So this is a low-scoring argument, and there are a couple of other examples here, which if you want to read them, like, isn't smoking just as disgusting as licking a cat, a trash can, a fly swatter, and other gross things lying outside the house? Yeah, there is a visual ad like that, and it doesn't test very well. It goes to the bottom of the list. All right, here are some of the characteristics of top 5 and bottom 5. First of all, on perceived effectiveness, well, guess what? Top 5 is higher than the bottom 5. That's by design. What about argument strength? Top 5 have higher argument strength than the bottom 5. What about positive emotion? There's more emotion in general, but more positive emotion as well in the top 5 than the bottom 5. Ditto for negative emotion. And for the presence of narrative, 4 out of the 5 have a narrative approach in the top 5, and 0 out of 5 have a narrative approach in the bottom 5. So you can see where we're going in terms of the general effects. Now the question is, what about, that's top 5 and bottom 5, what about the other 190? All right, so now we're going to go to that, and we'll get a little bit more technical here than is the case. I'm not going to play Rick Stoddard. So we have not a big data set, we have a big-ish data set. Big-ish in the sense is 200 PSAs, 2,500 smokers roughly. That gives us about 10,000 observations. That's big-ish. That's pretty good power. And we will, first thing I'm going to do is we're going to do population level, aggregate responses. Perceived effectiveness for the PSA, not for the person, for the PSA. So we're going to do just ad level analysis. So now our N is 200, right? Okay, our N is not 10,000. Our N is not 2,500. Our N is 200. And we have a whole bunch of formatting features. We try to reduce by clustering them into groups, and you'll see what some of those groups look like. I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that, except this one because it's the weirdest. One set of video features seems to cluster together called visual activation, and it works differently from almost any other feature. And it is a measure. This is an empirical clustering that takes place from simple kind of factor analytic work. Remember, this is factor analysis across ads by coding features, right? So it's a little bit more difficult to wrap your brain around that, but that's essentially what it is. This is the number of edits, number of faces, camera changes, emotional changes, object changes, perspective changes. These are all features that either come from Annie Lang's work or from the Amy work that seem to cluster together across these 200 ads. And this cluster becomes an ad feature. So it's not one feature, but it's a set of features and gives us some variation in the features across ads. Now this is a mess, right? Okay. I can point out to you the only thing we really care about. Do this. All right. Here we have various predictors from argument strength, right at the tippy top, this visual activation measure, and then as you go down here, narrative plus character, fear and guilt, and smoking cues. All right. This is where the guts of these findings are. So I put in a lot of data in here because I knew Ed was going to be in the audience, and he would be the person who would actually memorize this chart and know exactly. And the first thing he would ask is, well, when you put all these things together, are they any different from what's going on in the bivariate case? And well, what about the interactions between these and other things? So one of the things you can see is the interactions don't matter at all. The amount of variance explained without interactions is about 64%. The amount explained with the interactions is 66%. Aggregate data, not individual data. That's why it's over 60%. What's the predictions? Argument strength, is that positively related to message effectiveness? You betcha. In every study we've ever done, argument strength, evaluated the way we do it, is a significant predictor of outcome, in this case, perceived effectiveness. The only really negative effect is this visual activation. The more visual activation there is, all right, there's a borderline effect that says that visual activation depresses perceived effectiveness. Now remember, for those of you who are aficionados in this area, the message sensation value research has said the higher the message sensation value, the more appealing, the more effective an ad is for young people. These are not young people. The smokers in our studies average about 45 to 50 in age, so they're adults. This presence of a lot of these visual changes undermines perceived effectiveness. And notice, it undermines it, where's that negative sign? Bivariate regression, only that term, as well as with all the other terms present, although it's only borderline in this case. Audio activation does the opposite. Where is the one? Narrative. Narrative is the biggie. Look at that puppy. All right. Who's doing narrative? I know a couple of you are studying narrative. Good idea. Good idea. Narrative is an important predictor of perceived effectiveness. Now, we have narrative plus character, and the reason is that characters and narrative go hand in hand. Ads with characters in them, any characters, do better than ads without characters. Now, some of that is because the ads with characters are narratives, and some of the narratives, I mean, almost all of the narratives have characters. Ads with no characters in them are pretty much not narrative and don't do as well. But that's a big effect, and that effect stays, and it doesn't interact with anything. Second big effect is fear and guilt. Now you might say, what is fear and guilt anyway? It's negative emotion. But my argument about fear and guilt is that it's another aspect of argument strength. Because fear and guilt are created by appeals that create anxiety, that create guilt, that create a sense of worry. And so my view about emotion is these are emotional appeals. These are arguments that are being made. It's not just that they are intensifications of existing arguments, but they are another way of tapping into the arguments that are present. And finally, those are the big effects. Population. Right? Population. 66% of the variance. I'm pretty proud of that. Argument strength, negative emotional appeals, narrative and character, this visual activation thing that works opposite, audio activation. I forgot smoking cues. All right? We've done a lot of work on smoking cues. But one of the things that seems to be the case here is that ads with smoking cues, after you control out all that other stuff, seem to be more attention-getting for smokers. Now, is this a real surprise? Probably not. Probably not. Because smoking cues are an approach cue for smokers. They may be an avoidance cue for those of you in the audience who don't smoke. Certainly an avoidance cue for me. But for smokers, they are an attention-getting cue. So attention to smoking cues is consequential here, and leads people to say that ads are more effective. We've done other work that says the opposite for former smokers, and I won't get into that. That's another story for another day. Okay, so first question I want to say is, of these results, so based on a lot of data, of these results, which of them do we trust? This is the robustness argument. How do we make a claim about, is this cool with this? Is this what we want? And the way I do this is I say, I got a surprising finding that I can't quite make sense of and nobody else has gotten it, so I'm going to put it in the back of my mind and try to retest it sometime, but I'm not sure about it. But there are some effects I'm really sure about. Argument strength is one of them. All right? The intention to quit is higher in high argument strength versus low argument strength. PSAs in other studies, Wang and so on, this is actually a neuroscience study, attitudes toward quitting, higher after viewing high argument strength and low argument strength. But it's not just self-reports. It's also physical correlates of argument strength. You see that in the Wang study, that there are brain regions that are activated distinctly under high argument strength conditions and not under low argument strength conditions. We see that cotinine levels are lower 1 month after viewing high argument strength anti-smoking messages than low. And we see elevated heart rate and skin conductance in response to high argument strength messages in studies by Andrew Strasser and the rest of us. Argument strength is a powerful predictor. You cannot get away from it. Now, if we only knew how to make a strong argument. All right? We only know that we need them. We don't know how to do them. And that's another interesting question that we should talk about. And some of us have already been talking about it. I know you've been talking about it in seminar too, so that's cool. Engagement. It's one thing to have a strong argument. It's another thing to obviously get exposure. That's not what we're talking about, because I'm not telling you how to get exposure. What I am telling you about is, once you've got exposure, how do you maintain engagement with that exposure? How do you sustain attention? Given exposure, how do you sustain attention? How do you get people to allocate cognitive processing resources? And part of that has to do with some of these kinds of formatting features for doing so. And then where are the cognitive processing resources going? So we see, for example, that the presence of smoking cues draws attention. But is it drawing attention to the right things? We see that visual activation, while it would seem to be drawing attention, is actually reducing effectiveness. And so we worry a lot about the fact that something like visual activation actually undermines engagement with the materials at hand. And so the presence of engagement does reduce the overall effectiveness of the PSA. Is there any other evidence for this anywhere else? And the answer is yes, there is. We've seen, for example, with engagement vehicles that are positive, like narrative. We've seen in studies in the Journal of Communication recently by Hun-Suk Kim that exemplars in news enhanced engagement, which in turn enhanced intentions to quit. That other studies of PSAs by Min Kim in our lab, unpublished in this case, narrative was associated with judged effectiveness, and similarly for characters. And a best study in this whole sequence, this truly important study about narrative, is the study by Durkin and colleagues from Australia that appeared in the American Journal of Public Health, which showed that the presence of narratives and strong arguments with good measures of exposure was associated within media market with actual cessation in smoking. Not intentions to quit, but actual cessation. And so together, I think the argument that narratives are powerful and also an empirically strong effect is very much consistent with the prevailing evidence. I'm not going to say anything more about high MSV ads except one study that we've done that showed that high MSV ads, message sensation value ads, can dampen the effect of strong arguments. And so we have to be concerned about, in our case, about the presence of high activation PSAs, particularly with adults, maybe not so much with kids, but definitely with adults. Okay, I'm not going to go into this other evidence, but the full Monty kind of looks like this. Where is it? Do I have a full Monty? No, I don't have a full Monty up there. I got rid of it. All right, let's go backwards. All right. So we have good evidence, I think, for certain kinds of message effects at the population level. Now, the question is, does that explain? It doesn't explain all the variants. Importantly, when you look at variance decomposition of the perceived effectiveness of message PSAs, and you compare them, three components of variance or decomposition: individual variation across persons, variation across messages, and stuff you can't explain, and the residual, or what's left over. Guess what? The smallest of these is message effects. The biggest is residual, but not too far behind residual is individual patterns of response. So, if we want to study individual patterns of response, what I'm going to tell you that we should do, and I'll go quickly here in about 5 minutes and try to give you a flavor of what we're trying to accomplish. Let's take out from an individual's response the aggregate response. So we have a deviation score, which essentially is your assessment of the ad relative to the population's assessment. You have a deviation score. You're either higher or you're lower. But now that deviation score, because we can explain most of what's going on in the aggregate, what we can't explain is that deviation. So let's try to go explain that deviation to some degree. When we do that, and we rerun the models that I just showed you before, I won't put up another chart like that. I know Ed will be disappointed, but nobody else will be. What happens to argument strength is it's still a good predictor, okay? But it's half the size. So there's still individual variation that's being accounted for by argument strength. Character and narrative, still a significant predictor, but its size is reduced. Remember, it was like 1.3 or something like that. It was a big effect. It's reduced by a factor of 5, so it's much smaller. The negative emotion effects disappear, except for the becoming quite negative, but mainly for the oldest segments of the population. And this visual activation effect, the negative effect that undermine the ads, remains significant, but it's reduced by a factor of 3. Let me show you one outcome, just one, from this kind of individual assessment. And what we have here on the left-hand side are with the population effects present. Here we have on the right-hand side, we take the population effects out, all right? And we have either no characters and no persuasion, characters alone, or characters plus narrative, all three cases, right? Sharp effects, this is stage of change. First stage, lowest stage of change is leave me alone. Second stage of change is I'm thinking about it. All right, third stage of change is I'm planning to quit. All right, so that's kind of the three general levels. 1, 2, and 3, they all, as these go up, the effectiveness of the ads is seen as stronger, unsurprisingly, particularly strong when there's narratives and characters present. And those effects are muted when you go over to taking out the population effects. But what we see is that the effects are still present. So we still have message effects predicting individual variation, but we see them reduced in their consequences. That's one way of getting at these individual differences. I'm going to tell you about one other way. And I'll try to do this with some brevity. Think about recommendation systems. But think about Netflix. Think about Amazon. There are two kinds of recommender systems. Content-based and what are called collaborative. So, content-based is if you liked this message or you like this item, then you'll love another one that has a similar content profile. Collaborative recommendations, if you like the message or an item in Netflix or Amazon that somebody else did as well, you'll also like what else they did. All right? And we're all familiar with how this works, just so that everybody is clear. I want to mention, by the way, two people who are heavily involved in this work, Pung Oh and at ASC at USC, and C.J. Yang at ASC Penn. Okay. I like Baldacci, Ludlam, and Le Carre as authors in my junk fiction that I read. Will I like Scott Turow? One of the ways we find out is we look for people who are clones. People who also read Baldacci and others and like them. And we find out, did they read Turow and did they like Turow? If they are clones of me, all right, then, and they liked Turow, then I'll like Turow as an author. Contra clones, this is the language we're using for them now, are those who read Baldacci and so on and didn't like them. Right? So they don't look like me at all. They are not clones of me. Now, did they dislike or did they like Turow? Well, if they dislike Turow and they're different from me, then maybe I'll like Turow. If they're different from me, right, they're contra clones, and they liked Turow, then I'm probably going to not like Turow. Balance theory is what it's called. I know balance theory is dead, but it's back here. So that's the analogy. That's exactly the analogy. Replace Baldacci, Ludlam, Le Carre, and Scott Turow with 4 PSAs. Drop Turow. We're going to target PSA 4. And we're going to look for clones and counterclones to be. All right? We need pairs of people who evaluate the same messages. If they're similar, then they have a positive relationship. If they're dissimilar, they have a negative relationship. They're counterclones. All right? Then for all of the clones and counterclones that have similar evaluations, we look at what their evaluation of the target is, Scott Turow, okay, or message 4. So in this case, what we have is 1, 2, 3, 4 people. Their evaluation of message I turns out to be different for 3 and 4 because message I is evaluated by me, let's say, as something like a 2. But 10 and 2 are very different, 9 and 2 are very different, but 1 and 2 are not, evaluation is 3. 3 and 2 are not very different, 2 and 2 are exactly the same, so they're +1s on the clone, -1s on the counter clone. All right, let's get to, I'm not going to tell you how we did this, we need to get to the results. We got good results. Here's what they are. We're predicting my evaluation of a message I haven't seen, based on people who are clones of mine, not on that message, but on other messages that we've seen together, or counter clones of me on messages that we have seen together, but not the target message. And we're predicting the target message. And here's the finding. The clones' average scores of the unseen message predicting my response ought to be positive. It is, and it's significant. The counter clone's preference for the message that we haven't seen ought to be negative, and it is. And we keep it, by the way, this is deviation scores. The aggregate score is taken out. So this is about the individual's response. And we take out the number of clones and the number of counter clones because it's based, it's based on more people. You say, well, it's a more stable response, but let's take that out by control for it. We've got the positive effect and we've got the negative effect. And this is very exciting. No, not very exciting to Amazon, not very exciting to Netflix, but it's exciting to me. Why? Because nobody's done this with messages. Nobody. And we're predicting individual difference. We're predicting the individual response over and above what's in the baseline response, which we think we can predict pretty well. Right? We think we can predict pretty well. No content prediction, no content similarity here at all, just similarity in preferences. Now, we're going to go a couple more places with this that we haven't gone yet, but on the horizon. We've got one-step clones, we need two-step clones. We won't go beyond three-step clones. Two-step clones. And we'll see what happens with the two-step clones. Then we're going to want to weight the clones by content similarity. If the clones are similar on messages which have content in common, then shouldn't we weigh that more heavily? Just like, we're, instead of, in the four cases I gave you, the Baldacci, Ludlum, and so on, and Tarot, these are all mystery writers in some way, shape, or form. If we're going to add into this, Shakespeare, prediction probably won't work so well because the content similarity is so different. All right? So we may need to weight these by content similarity. We haven't done that yet, and we're going to try to do that next. But you can see where we are going. I'm not going to tell you about next generation studies. You can see where we're going. We use objective message features as much as we can, or aggregate message features, and account for population level outcomes. We've done, I think, a pretty good job there. We then take the population level effects out, which we think we can predict pretty well, and go to the individual level effects. We still see those deviations accounted for to some degree by message features. But there's more left to explain. Explain an additional looks like about 15% of the variance with these one-step clones and counter clones. We probably can add a few more percent with two-step counter clones, maybe a few more percent with content weighted clones and counter clones. And now the question is, well, Cappella, are you going to be building a Netflix for health messages? And the answer is no, of course not. No one would do something like that. That's silly. But what we might be able to do is to use this kind of modeling, this predictive modeling, to build an online adaptive system in which we give somebody what we think might work for them based on their a priori profiles, and see how they respond. If they respond, in a negative way, we give them an adaptive move in this direction, or an adaptive move in that direction, and we can do message testing in an adaptive way that we could not do before. So that's where I want to go with this. Somebody said to me, I got to take it to the Penn Center for Innovation. I said, I don't think so. I said, I don't think our algorithms are anywhere near Netflix algorithms or Amazon's algorithms. But they are applied in a domain that's really quite unique. And that's what we're going to try to go with them in the future. That's it. Happy to take questions.
Some of the great things about the message effectiveness models that you're drawing on, things like Lang, things like Donahue, Palm Reads, they really allow for fairly strict quantification of the amount of these things in messages. But all the effects you're talking about, and this is probably the purpose, are linear effects. There is some research, and this got me to my mind when you started talking about fear and guilt. There is some research, although inconsistent at this point, about curvilinear effects of things like fear. And I'm wondering, especially for things where you might have expected effects, if you look for curvilinear effects, you just didn't find.
Absolutely, there aren't.
Okay.
But the one place where we did see that was the interaction between that activation measure and age. I might have that here as a hidden slide. We did see a curvilinear effect with age as people got older and older in the sample. The ineffectiveness of high activation messages went up for that older part of the sample, which is exactly what, well, I don't know if you would expect that, but that would be a place to look. That's one of the few curvilinear effects we got. One of the things we expected from the get-go was to see that a standard measure of MSV, a standard measure of I-squared audio and visual out of Lang would show a curvilinear effect to effectiveness or engagement, and we didn't get it. It's just not there. Not in our data.
Does that potentially imply that in the format that you're dealing with PSA specifically, there's just not enough road to see that curvilinear?
That's very possible, yeah. And maybe you get it by shoving the levels of I-squared and so on right through the roof. But then, are you now dealing with real PSAs or ones that you invented in the lab to show the curvilinear effect? And, it's perfectly good reason for doing that, for theoretical reasons, but not for practical reasons. Other questions? Yes?
Is the possibility of reactance to PSAs covered with the fear kind of measure?
We've thought, in some of our studies, we've cast reactance measures. This ad tried to manipulate me, exaggerates, and so on. And that clearly operates in a way that is counter to, it's negatively correlated with perceived effectiveness when people think that they're trying to be manipulated. We did one study, which we've never tried to publish. It's too bad because I think it's a really cool study in which we actually picked ads that were high in reactance and ones that were low in reactance. And the high reactance ads do very badly because people think like they're being manipulated and they're being over dramatized and so on. But what was cool about that study was not just that finding, which is kind of obvious in some ways, but rather that we were coding for features that would be indicators of the extent to which the reactance would be high and not just rated as high. And a colleague of mine, Paul Nassaris, who's interested in visual communication studies, kind of pushed that because he thought that would be, but you're absolutely right, that's exactly what we get.
Your question about visual activation and this relationship to the page, there's probably a source that you wouldn't have consulted that might help. Aristotle says, and they're
Good friend of mine. I love Aristotle. Go with Aristotle. Like everybody else. We put the rest of it.
In
Go ahead.
poetics, he says that spectacle is the least distinguished element of drama, and it's attractive to the mob. And arguably, Aristotle might be making a distinction here on literacy, and that the more literate the audience is, the more it will disrespect the visual activation. And while I'm at the board, Aristotle is also very coherent with your account, because the elements of drama that he identifies are plot, character, language, acoustic factors, and spectacle. And it occurs to me that what these things need to do, they're drama without catharsis.
Absolutely. They're definitely drama. A good PSA, which you can do in 30 seconds. You can tell a story, and you can actually have a plot in the story. It doesn't have to just be a chronology. It can literally be a plot. But I have to tell you a counter story, okay? And that is, when I was at Wisconsin, Lloyd Bitzer was my next door neighbor in our offices. So Lloyd and I had a great relationship. We played softball together, and we talked about trying to get together. And one of the things he would always say is, "Oh, when you're working," I'd tell him something. He said, Campbell said that.
Yeah.
So he didn't go all the way back to Aristotle, but he went back to Campbell. And he said, Campbell said that because Campbell was his kind proman of the, whatever it was, 18th century or something like that. And he said, yeah, because he was a psychologist. He was interested in the psychology of the audience. So he insisted to tell me that whatever I had just recently found out that Kimball had predicted. And I said, okay, Lloyd, I'll stop doing the work. So you went back to Aristotle, I appreciate that. Logos, pathos, and ethos. Ability, emotion, and logic.
Well, the time is 1 p.m. Unless we have one last question.
I'm happy to talk to people afterwards too, if you'd
Yeah.
like to ask some, informal sorts of questions or formal questions. Or tag me personally, you're welcome to do that. Thank you very much for the opportunity.